society, and governance. ESG investment is a word that most Canadians will probably become familiar with next year, even if they don't know now. And how do we step up to this challenge? That's what we're talking about today. Things like carbon capture and hydrogen, Indigenous inclusion and economic reconciliation, critical minerals and metals that will supply the energy transformation happening already around us very quickly. A forest sector that provides renewable, sustainable lumber and paper products, a chemical industry that is aligned to the environmental goals that we have. So one of the problems, there's no clear roadmap on how we get there. That's part of what we're doing at the task force. We're ready to continue our efforts working with parliamentarians, with the civil service, with civic society across Canada to deal with these challenges. So I'd like to move on to the expert panel, which is really the main course here today. We have 5 speakers, and I will quickly introduce them before turning to the first name. And that first name is, and I'll run through all these names before I come back to Adam Legg, the president of the Business Council of Alberta. Each of these speakers will speak for 5 minutes. We do have questions, as I mentioned. Use the chat function to send them to us, and we'll wrangle them from there. Second speaker will be Karen Ogun-Taves, CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance and councillor with the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in British Columbia. Corey Channon, the International Director of Climate Change with the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers Canada Union. We have Mayor Alana Natiu, the chair of Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association and the mayor of Sturgeon County, Alberta. Also a member of our advisory council, like Patricia Moore, our final speaker, a commodity market specialist, former vice president of Scotiabank in economics. I would like to return now to our first speaker, Adam Legg. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Stuart, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time in your busy days to join us. I'd like to speak about the issues Stuart has raised, and essentially climate change is a leading threat to our collective well-being. We know that, it's well documented and studied. It's one of the biggest environmental, social, economic, and ethical challenges of our time. Canada is committed to being a global leader, reducing carbon emissions by more than 30% this decade, and introduced legislation aimed at achieving net zero by 2050. Canada's natural resource sector can play a critical role in ensuring we address the imperatives of climate action while also delivering a competitive, prosperous economy and accelerating innovation. And that's why the inclusion of the resource sector is so vital in Canada's recovery and rebuilding efforts. I can tell you Canada's leading resource companies are on board to drive the low carbon economy of the future. In fact, it's critical that climate solutions are inclusive of the people, groups, and sectors represented across the diversity of the people you hear from today. We can't get there without the sector or its amazing workers. Now, I'm here today representing the largest employers of Alberta, and this includes many of Canada's largest resource companies in fuel, food, and fiber. These companies can be strong partners in environmental and economic action. In fact, the full 3/4 of clean investment in Canada comes from the natural resource sector today. I want to share with you a very small selection of projects happening now in Alberta that demonstrate business sector leadership and the drive for innovation, resource activity, and climate action. In carbon capture, the newly launched Alberta Carbon Trunk Line is the largest carbon capture project in the world. In solar, Canada's largest off-grid solar project, in partnership with 3 First Nations, recently energized in Alberta, and Canada's second largest solar facilities are in construction here in the province. In terms of power, Alberta has actively been greening its electricity system. In fact, Alberta's largest power generator has already reduced emissions by 50%, or 21 million tons of CO2, and the entire grid will be off coal by 2023. Now, that's more than close to a decade ahead of its scheduled elimination of coal-powered electricity generation. In batteries, Alberta's first grid-scale battery storage project, Wind Charger, launched this year, and we have the minerals required to enhance battery production in Canada. And finally, in hydrogen, it is indeed a fuel of tomorrow, but it isn't science fiction. We're producing and testing hydrogen fuels in Alberta, and in fact, the industrial heartland in northern Alberta is one of the key leading areas in this country in that space. Canada can be one of the world's leaders in low-cost production of blue hydrogen at scale, and by capturing the emissions and using those emissions productively for products as diverse as soap and carbon fiber. In addition, as you'll hear in a moment, the resource sector has played a pivotal role in working with Indigenous communities to achieve economic reconciliation and have created many businesses and jobs to be created that result in meaningful prosperity for Indigenous peoples in Canada. In this broad and diverse task force, we've collectively worked to present actionable recommendations, including to attract investment to decarbonize today and grow the economy, incent challenge-driven innovation. The world needs fuel, food, fiber, materials. Canada is uniquely positioned to provide it to them across our innovative and sustainable resource sector. And finally, to develop the energy systems of the future. As you'll hear from my colleagues on this task force today, these recommendations will assist with really good and strong jobs for Canadians, economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and achieving climate commitments and building future energies. How we achieve our environmental ambitions is by making the recovery inclusive of the natural resource sector, working with the resource companies to create prosperity for Canadians. The economy and the environment are simply intertwined. If we do this right, we can be at a watershed moment for climate and natural resources in Canada. For our policymakers, I come here with 3 key points. The natural resource sector is on board as a partner in a low carbon future. They are part of the solution and not part of the problem to be eliminated. Secondly, already a huge percentage of green investment in Canada is coming from this sector, and they're actively and aggressively doing more. And finally, what we ask of you is a hand-in partnership, a strong voice of support for the sector, inclusion in recovery efforts and spending, and the right policy and regulatory environment to enable innovation, investment, and meaningful job creation and prosperity. Thanks very much. I look forward to any questions in the future and turn it back to Stuart.
Thank you. That was Adam Legg, President of the Business Council of Alberta. Our next speaker is Karen Ogun-Taves, CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance and councillor with the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. Karen, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Stalo Nation, the territory that I reside on and that I'm speaking from, and I want to thank them for acknowledging me being a visitor to their territory. First, let me say it's good to see Bill C-15, the UNDRIP bill, finally in the parliamentary works. It's going to take time, I understand. 3 years, though, does seem a remarkably loose timetable, but the bill is a welcome start, even if it comes a full 416 years after the first European settlement in Canada. I recognize that some resource industries fear that free, prior, and informed consent under UNDRIP may make it harder to do business in Canada and raise the financial risks. But if we get this right, I think that it should really create more certainty. For one thing, UNDRIP is a process, not a do or die legal veto. The law does not have to lead to 1990 and Elijah Harper's one-man constitutional thinking of the Meech Lake Accord in a Manitoba legislature. And of course, Bill C-15 creates no new rights. We Indigenous peoples have rights in our territories, and successive court cases have upheld these rights. At this point, by the way, First Nations have won more than 300 court cases on rights and title and related issues. After government gets this UNDRIP approach right, there are 2 more stakeholders who have to get it right: resources, industries, and First Nations themselves. If they work together in partnership, the benefits of resource development can go to both. And we see big LNG developers doing it right, in partnership with First Nations in BC and Quebec. Our First Nations need those benefits. Some First Nations hope to turn true partnerships in resource development into equity ownership. I hope we will soon see that becoming the usual way of doing business. You know, we First Nations can do business and do it well. There are 60,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada, and they contribute more than $12 billion a year to the economy. And as my friend JP Gladue says, we're gunning for 100 billion. I am a member and elected councillor and a former elected chief of the Wet'suwet'en Nation in BC. We are one of the 20 nations who support the Coastal GasLink pipeline that will feed the LNG Canada development on Haisla Nation territory on the northwest BC coast. You no doubt know that The elected council of the Wet'suwet'en supports the pipeline, and so do a majority of our people. But a small group of hereditary chiefs seek to block the pipeline project. To me, this issue is one of the Wet'suwet'en people to resolve. Some politicians seem to think they are the ones to make decisions on the governance of the Wet'suwet'en. Please stand down and let us resolve it. As I mentioned, the Coastal GasLink pipeline will feed gas to LNG Canada, and the result will be the cleanest liquefied natural gas in the world. The pipeline will also feed First Nations people and families. So far, something like 1/3 of all the work completed on Coastal GasLink project has been done by Indigenous people. Over time, First Nations people will share in $1 billion worth of opportunities for local and Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous people have already had access to training and have had earned qualifications. These benefits are also held out by the LNG Canada project. But as the Chief Executive Officer of the First Nations LNG Alliance, I want to draw the attention of parliamentarians to this. Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada have long and honestly promised opportunities for our First Nations people. And Indigenous people have certainly benefited in many ways. Just ask my friend Crystal Smith, elected Chief Councillor of the Haisla Nation. But some of the contractors and subcontractors have not been getting the message, or worse, have been deliberately dodging the message. In too many cases of small contractors bringing in non-Indigenous workers from outside BC, while the big developers see hiring local First Nations people as a priority. There seem to be an awful lot of workers on the job who are non-Indigenous and have Alberta plates on their vehicles. All that said, LNG development has been a genuine bonus for many First Nations communities and people. I do not have to remind you that we need it. Poverty is a shocking fact of life in Canadian Indigenous communities. Half of our children live in poverty. Our unemployment can hit 70%. We suffer from poor health, poor housing, lower life expectancy, addiction problems, suicides, and limited education and graduation rates. For my nation and for others, LNG development offers a pathway away from all of that. 42 countries around the world now import LNG. That number is set to grow as more nations switch to natural gas to reduce their dependence on coal and oil and cut greenhouse gas emissions. I hope that BC and Canada will play a huge role in supplying those nations, bringing revenue to Canada that will fund government programs and will help close those huge socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. Please support our responsible development of natural gas and LNG. Masai.
Thank you, Karen Ogan. The Indigenous discussions we had through the task force report making over the summer formed a major pillar of our findings, and I point you to railrecovery.ca to see the full report and all of those findings. I'd like to move on to Corey Shannon. Corey's the International Director of Climate Change Policy Solutions with the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers Canada. Corey, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, our International President and Executive Council, I certainly wish to thank you and thank the task force and Resource Works for allowing me this brief opportunity to explain something about carbon capture technology. First of all, workers deserve these opportunities, and we deserve to be part of the energy transformation in Canada and around the world. Innovation is the path to that. Investments in carbon capture by the Canadian government will enable us to seize the opportunity in ways that will result in a win-win-win for economy, environment, and workers. Carbon capture essentially is a vacuum system in industrial facilities that will capture greenhouse gas emissions and utilize them to develop new products or inject it into the ground very safely, and it's a proven technology. Direct air capture is similar, but it's drawing atmospheric air and cleaning it up, and also allowing it to develop, again, new utilization purposes. And it's truly amazing what this technology can and will do. Global experts out there, such as the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have all said that in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in any meaningful way, we have to utilize carbon capture technology. Being a first mover in the mass deployment of carbon capture technology would immediately position Canada's resource experts as the most competitive low carbon products in the world. With this new report that has come out through ResourceWorks, and with a federal tax incentive for carbon capture, this would attract considerable investment, which is essential to accelerate the deployment at a climate relevant scale, and which would ensure that Canadian industry and workers would be brought along in that transformation. The future is not resource free, it's resource intensive, but low carbon. And Canada must continue to be a global leader in its natural resources. And this will determine whether we can continue to be prosperous and secure. And let's take these right steps and move forward. CCS, or carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, is very promising, but it's just one example of what Canada's natural resource industries are capable of. This technology can be applied to all industries to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And those are my brief remarks. And again, I really thank you on behalf of the Boilermakers to make these remarks. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Corey Shannon. So much more to learn about carbon capture, and we'll be helping to provide some of that information in 2021. Moving on, Mayor Alana Natu is chair of Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association. Whenever I speak with Alana, we wind up talking about hydrogen, and I suspect that's what you'll be hearing from her a little bit in a moment. Well, now, over to you, Mayor Alana.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association is a 20-year-old partnership between 5 municipalities, including and surrounding the northeast region of the city of Edmonton. The municipal partners set aside 582 square kilometers of heavy industrial zone land and work together to plan for its sustainable development and market the investment opportunity internationally. The energy cluster is now Canada's largest hydrocarbon processing region and a major employment center and economic engine for Alberta and Canada. Our region takes the raw commodity feedstock that is produced in abundance in Alberta and adds value to these natural resource products, creating the foundational elements of sustainable products the modern economy demands. As an example, one of our most recent facilities being built is a $4.6 billion polypropylene plant. This facility adds approximately 7 times the value compared to the natural resource feedstock, producing a new product for Canada and one that is essential for our frontline healthcare workers' safety as a main ingredient in PPE. With continued growth in global demand for the consumer products that we help produce, we are well positioned to lead an energy sector transformation that can help Canada become a global leader in net zero manufacturing. Alberta's Industrial Heartland is the backdrop in which we can align the nation's net zero, inclusive growth, and economic recovery objectives. We share the same vision as most Canadians when it comes to reducing waste, be it carbon or plastic. Our region is a prime example of how government and industry can work together to reduce carbon emissions and limit plastic waste into our landfills. With sound public policy, the Heartland can help develop a circular economy for Canada that define what a modern petrochemical sector can look like for the world. We are well positioned to be the eco-industrial cluster of choice for global investors who wish to become a part of this clean energy and sustainable product transformation. Policy alignment across all 3 levels of government is crucial to our success, and it requires an acknowledgement that we need to diversify our economy based on our natural competitive advantages rather than divesting from our current position of strength. We can leverage our feedstocks to create low carbon products beyond just energy. It's important to remember that industrial zones such as ours are one of the greatest opportunities to significantly reduce emissions from manufacturing. There are decarbonization levers that you can only pull in an industrial cluster. With economies of scale, you can drive down the cost of capturing and storing carbon. We are already home to multiple carbon capture projects, including the world's largest carbon dioxide pipeline. Consider that out of the approximately 700 refinery complexes in the world, only 3 of those are carbon capture enabled. And of those, 2 are in Alberta's industrial heartland. We are also home to one of the world's only 3 carbon capture fertilizer facilities. The companies operating in the heartland are changing the face of heavy industrial activity. Not only are these companies contributing billions of dollars to local spending each year, they are already sequestering the equivalent amount of carbon associated with taking more than all of the cars off of Edmonton city streets. The international agency acknowledges that CCUS will need to form a key pillar of effort to put the world on a path to net zero by 2050. And with the right type of government support, I'm pleased to say that we're poised for even more carbon reductions through CCUS. With the region's extensive CCUS infrastructure already in place, Alberta's industrial heartland is uniquely positioned to be Canada's first low-carbon hydrogen node. Utilizing Western Canada's low-cost natural feedstock and leveraging CCUS infrastructure, our region already produces North America's most affordable low-carbon hydrogen, otherwise known as blue hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel can be used to power municipal bus fleets, heavy haul trucks, and trains that require too much energy for batteries to supply. It can also be used for blending into industrial natural gas consumption as well as home heating. Right here in the heartland, we already have Western Canada's first hydrogen blending project, with clean burning gas being added to the residential natural gas supply to lower overall emissions from home heating. And as the world races to compete in the hydrogen economy, Canada can capitalize on its competitive advantage and be a leader in this low carbon fuel. There is much conversation around green versus blue, where green hydrogen is produced from electrolysis using water and renewable power. Blue hydrogen is produced from natural gas with CO2 emissions captured in the CCUS infrastructure. Blue hydrogen using autothermal reforming technology would also enable capture of 90 to 95% of the CO2 emissions. So in order to make a step change in the energy transformation, blue hydrogen will need to be a part of the mix, as it facilitates large volumes of energy production for both domestic and export opportunities, enabling economies of scale. To put things into context, to meet the incremental net zero electricity demand in 2050 in Canada alone, 30 new nuclear plants the size of Bruce Power would be required. And while we're well positioned to produce low carbon hydrogen for Western Canada, we are also positioned to supply global markets, which will be ideal once we can actually offset coal-fired power emissions in Asia and make a real dent in global emissions. Consumer markets have clearly signaled value will be placed on sustainably produced products, and Alberta's industrial heartland will have a clear competitive advantage with its CCUS, as well as hydrogen, and a commitment to the plastics circular economy. Our region is synonymous with the energy sector's transformational aspirations and ESG priorities shared by all Canadians. With proper policy, our region could be an economic driver for the country as it seeks to rebound from this pandemic. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mayor Elena. We're moving on to our final and 5th speaker. That's Patricia Moore, Commodity Market Specialist. Over to you, Patricia.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say it's been a great pleasure to be a participant in the Task Force for Real Jobs, Real Recovery. And I wanted to point out the ongoing importance of Canada's natural resource industries to economic prosperity all across Canada, to strong wage growth, and of course to Canada's merchandise trade. As you know, natural resource exports from Canada remain the top 4 volume contributors to Canada's merchandise trade. Oil and gas alone last year accounted for $62.3 billion of net exports for Canada, and offset very large deficits in consumer goods, all sorts of equipment, electronic products that we export into Canada. One of the sectors that I think is going to be a very big net winner from the development of new industry that has to do with mitigating the negative impact of climate change. And those are renewable energy, solar and wind, and the development of the electric car, the development of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, particularly for heavy haul vehicles. One of the big net winners of that change in the industrial outlook is actually going to be metals and mining. And of course, Canada traditionally has had a very strong mineral sector. I note with some interest as a former commodity analyst at Scotiabank in Toronto, the big rally in copper prices that has occurred this year, despite the impact of the pandemic. That has partly to do, of course, with China's recent rebound from the downturn earlier in the year caused by the pandemic, has to do partly with production losses due to COVID-19 in countries such as Peru and Chile, but it also has to do with a newfound positive sentiment on the outlook for copper that has to do with the development of the electric vehicle and renewable energy. And as you may know, there's 3 times more copper under the hood of an electric vehicle than there is under the hood of a petroleum-based vehicle. So we're beginning to see quite a change in sentiment for things like copper. Copper now is $3.50 a pound on the London Metal Exchange, a very lucrative number. It is high enough to justify new development, new mine development. And I'm hoping to see some big step up in mine development across Canada in Ontario, Quebec, BC. There's a lot of growing demand for battery materials, lithium and cobalt. And of course, the rare earths, we're hoping to develop with the United States new supply chains for rare earths, and 4 of them are used in magnets in things like electric vehicles. So a lot of opportunity for Canada's mining industry, and really looking forward to seeing some of these great new developments. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand the microphone back to Stuart. Oh.
You're muted.
It was bound to be me. We've now heard from all 5 speakers. Thank you all. And we've got questions coming in. So reminder, use the chat, send questions in. There's other ways. If you're seeing this on YouTube, you can submit as well. We're monitoring all that. I'd like to get into some questions here. Got a good one here, and I'm going to read it. And I will ask Karen Ogan-Taves to be the first one to touch on this question. What is the response to those that would assert that the environmental impact of natural resource projects strongly outweighs the economic benefits, particularly with regards to Indigenous communities? I'll read that again. Just one more time here. What is the response to those that would assert that the environmental impact of natural resource projects strongly outweighs the economic benefits, particularly with regards to Indigenous communities? Karen Ogan-Taves, what have you to say about this?
Okay, thank you for that question. In my view, I believe that if that is the perception, we all have a responsibility to continue to advocate, to continue to have the highest environmental standards, while at the same time continue to promote and advocate for the highest economic standards to close those gaps in Indigenous communities. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And do continue with the questions, use the chat. I'd like to move on to another question. And this is one thing I might take a run at myself because it's an area I follow. It's to do with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I've been following it for years. I was one of the editors of the Citizen's Guide to the Trans Mountain Project a few years ago, so I've pretty much immersed myself in this topic. But I may turn to the panel, particularly Adam Legg, to amplify. Here's the question, wondering if one of you can speak on the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Office report that came out yesterday on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and pipeline capacity writ large versus energy demand predictions. We saw that report came out. There was certainly coloring placed on that report by some voices I know. It's become a key talking point, as a questioner says here, for opponents of oil and gas development in Canada. In your opinion, what does the market look like to fill demand after these 20-year contracts run out? So after 2042, that's an excellent question. And I do agree that the PBO report gave rise to a healthy discussion in this regard. If you look at what the project itself is talking about, President Ian Anderson of the TMX project spoke recently at the Vancouver Board of Trade. He stated that the annual profit going to whoever owns the pipeline in future, be that the people of Canada or other owners, will amount to between $1.3 and $1.5 billion per year. As the PBO report notes, the benefits of having just TMX to reducing the discount by which we must sell our oil to the United States, we have no other choice, will create about $6 billion in benefits alone. And that's just for the general uplift of the oil industry. So this is not even before the jobs and services through the supply chain. So in the 20-year horizon, I also, when I look to projections from the International Energy Organization, you know, they are, despite the COVID moment we're in, which has seen a drastic, quick reduction in oil demand for obvious reasons. We're not driving, we're not flying. There's a lot of speculation as to what the rebound will be. No one knows what that is. Lots of opinions about that. I'd like to turn to Adam, who I know also follows markets over the long term. Adam Legg, would you like to weigh in on this?
Thanks, Stuart. I really appreciate the question. There's sort of two key points I'd raise with this one. The first being, I'm reminded of the infamous Bill Gates quote of why would anyone need more than 640K memory in a computer. It's sort of trying to predict the future based on existing demand and a whole host of uncertainties. And so I think really what we're facing is the conversation around oil and gas demand is really a set of varying scenarios, and we don't really have any true sense of what that might look like. And so I would suggest that it's best to move forward on a range of scenario basis. We know that obviously COVID has impacted oil demand for the current and likely very short-term future. But beyond that, as you've heard from many of my colleagues, whether it is continued oil demand globally, whether it is development of natural gas, the resource base of the future is still very, very strong. The second point I'd raise, and it speaks very much to the hydrogen issue, is, you know, I think there's a wide-scale belief that with the emergence of Canada's hydrogen opportunity, that all of a sudden this transportation infrastructure or linear transportation infrastructure will go away. And the reality is that's just not the case. Hydrogen itself will need transport infrastructure. And so while we may be developing projects right now that are satisfying crude oil demand, over time, these I think will very likely see some of these repurposed for different kinds of purposes, whether it's natural gas or hydrogen. So I don't think these investments in linear infrastructure or expanding port infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure are going to be wasted investments. I just think we have to have a longer term view in the repurposing of these because for Canada to seize the hydrogen opportunity will require continued linear infrastructure development such as pipelines, as well as the expansion of other infrastructure, including our port facilities, et cetera. So I would just encourage us to take a longer term view of Canada's energy transformation and think about what those opportunities might be in that holistic system as opposed to just specific demands at the current time.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. That's an excellent question, and I'm sure there will be more in days ahead from our commentators. Moving on to another question, and do keep them coming. We have time. I would like to touch on a broader issue, which is how does government drive these innovations, including the ones we're talking about here? And I would like to turn to Alana Nachu in Edmonton to answer this question. In particular, how do you see government policy, federal policy, tied perhaps to 2030 climate ambitions, affecting what you think needs to happen in your sector?
Well, once again, I believe we do need to leverage our natural resources and our competitive advantages rather than divesting away. So I certainly hope that we see strong signals from the federal government that acknowledge that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is an integral component of Canada's net zero framework. We need to ensure that we are competitive with other advanced nations making serious net zero commitments. And this requires matching or exceeding the US measures to support CCUS, such as the 45Q tax benefit. We also need the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to have the mandate to help industry make real reductions in emissions and establish a net zero infrastructure that will be required for Canada to compete globally. We would also ask that the federal government continue to support the development and growth of the Heartland hydrogen node and support opportunities to help make exports of hydrogen or hydrogen carriers viable. And we certainly think it's crucial to get the clean fuel standard right, which means taking the time to figure out how the gaseous stream can support low carbon fuel production while not at the same time hampering the rest of industry from making the energy sector transformation that is needed. So certainly just strong work between, in a platform that will have industry and government sharing information and creating the appropriate policies that also create the ability to reach the aggressive targets that we have.
Mm-hmm. Alana, you mentioned 45Q. For those who may not be familiar with this U.S. Policy, can you explain that?
Yeah, it's actually giving some tax credit for the amount of carbon that you put into sequestration. So it's acknowledging, much like a carbon credit, this is just tying it into the CCUS, which obviously incents people to capture carbon, but also to build the infrastructure and create the business model around that. So those are important steps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I'd just like to come to a question that comes to us from YouTube, and thank you those on YouTube. What do the panelists see are the impacts of ESG investing going forward? Maybe I could start with a higher level thing, and I know once again Adam Legg will have a broad perspective on what he's hearing from the industries you speak to. Adam?
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks for the question. Yes, ESG is having a significant impact on the resource sector already, and it will continue to as well. I think what it's doing is ensuring that capital markets pushing resource sector into not only performing in a strong environmental, social, and governance way, but also reporting on those performance metrics as well. I think where Canada performs very strongly, incredibly strong, probably the strongest in the world on the S and the G components of ESG. Where we do need to improve and continue to improve is on the E side, and many of the examples I gave earlier is that you've got the sectors driving significant investment innovation towards clean resource activity and dropping the emissions profile. So there's tremendous work underway. I think where you see some challenges, quite frankly, are that there are a host of different ESG reporting frameworks. You're beginning to see some coalescence around frameworks like TCFD and PRI, but there's still a host of metrics, and each sort of area of capital markets determines the ones they're going to use. So I think what we ultimately need to see is the beginning of some sort of standardization around that, so that it can be easier for companies to perform. But we also want to make sure that it's not so stringent that it really hinders continued investment in Canada's resource sector. and that we make it so that investment can continue to flow. Companies are increasingly reporting on their performance in those sectors. You look at many of the ESG or sustainability reports coming out of Canada's resource sector are truly phenomenal. You're seeing some of those happen. You're seeing many companies recognize the importance of ESG by making net zero commitments, and there are a number of oil and gas companies, Canadian oil and gas companies, that have made that commitment to a net zero by 2050. The other final piece I'd add is it's also important that the capital markets not lose sight of another E in that equation, and that isn't really referred to. And Mac Van Willigen, one of our founders, speaks very strongly about this, and that is economics. The importance of not only the ES and the G all lining up, but it has to make sense from an economic standpoint. And I think that's critical to the message we're sharing today, is that there is a tremendous economic aspect when companies are working towards an ESG framework and continuing to perform on an ESG basis. But we have to make sure the conditions are right, that the policy is right, and that the competitiveness is right, so that we can make it an economically viable sector and opportunity, such that it can create jobs, it can create opportunity, it can create reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So it all has to come together in a broad-based double EESG framework to make it viable in the future.
Thanks, Adam. I'd like to swing over to Patricia Moore, who has her own views on this investor lens of ESG, environment, society, and governance that is increasingly being applied to any investment in the world, and it has implications for Canada. Patricia, you've spent a career talking to investors. What's your take on today's challenges for ESG?
Well, I do think it's very important, and I think, though, that a lot of the major companies in the resource space in Canada have been putting a lot of emphasis, really, for quite a number of years on the whole aspect of the environment and the social and governance aspect of things has been a very important part of corporate governance for some time now. And so I think that the interesting thing that appears to be happening internationally is that there's a bigger lens being placed on ESG by financial institutions. I'd say particularly on the equity side of the market, mutual fund managers looking at this very closely and trying to measure it. And it's the measurement that that is really the big change, and will be very interesting to see how this actually develops over time. But certainly in the oil and gas space in Canada, in mining, there has been a lot of emphasis put on ESG now for some time, I'd say, by the larger companies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Patricia. We are also hearing that investors are looking for certain signals from the federal government in Canada. Can you give us a clue as to what those signals would be? How can parliamentarians, those in policy, reflect to ESG evaluators what's really going on in Canada?
Well, I
put you on the spot.
I think there's a bigger emphasis on really measuring ESG, and that's, of course, a difficult thing to do. But most companies now put out reports, annual sustainability reports, where they talk at some length about how they are setting up their goals and objectives on particularly on the environment, and how they're measuring it. And there's a lot more detail, particularly from larger companies, that's coming out. There's an attempt, I think, over time to measure things like greenhouse gas intensity for those who are interested in climate change to measure greenhouse gas intensity by different kinds of production. For example, how intensive is production in the oil sands compared to tight oil in the United States. The interesting thing about that question is that I don't think there's really a clear answer. No one actually knows, but there is being work done now to look at that. And of course, Alberta's oil industry is putting a lot of capital into reducing its greenhouse gas intensity and having some success in doing this, I would say, which is very interesting. I'm on the board of Emissions Reduction Alberta, which is a corporation that funds R&D on greenhouse gas reduction. And a few years ago, we put up quite a bit of capital to accelerate greenhouse gas reduction innovation. And we're now beginning to see the results of that, and very interesting to see Imperial Oil's project. They expect a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas intensity through their new oil sands technology. So we're going to have some success on this. Takes a lot of time, a lot of capital, but it's coming and it will be measurable over time.
Thank you, Patricia. Great question coming up here. And I would point to Corey. I'm going to turn this to you in a moment. Here's the question. Is this creating opportunities for workers? I'll take that to mean, does the domain we're talking about, the natural resource and supporting sectors, create opportunities for workers? We asked that question in the course of doing our work over the spring and summer on this. We commissioned an economist, Dr. Kent Fellows, and in a nutshell, the report that he brought back after applying his methodology was the right success conditions for natural resources and manufacturing could mean up to 2.6 million new jobs and as much as a 17% jump in real, real GDP. That's what we found from this neutral specialist, and we felt that it meant we were on the right track. But I would like to add the dimension of what are workers actually experiencing in reality, and for that I'll go back to Corey from the Boilermakers Union. I mean, we know that CCUS is an opportunity for workers if things need to be built and maintained. Could you elaborate on how this might work? Should we be able to move ahead on scale with these projects?
Most certainly, and I think it's a wonderful question. Not only when you apply this technology are you creating new jobs, you're actually preserving well-paid, meaningful jobs. And that's very important economically and environmentally. There's also recent papers that would highlight that I think it's very important that people review this so they can have a better understanding of the economic impact. Would be a white paper that was created by the International CCS Knowledge Center. It's outstanding, and they outline the economic benefits of just building 3 carbon capture facilities. So you can also, expand on that when realistically we need thousands of these things globally. So you have to look at storage capacity, and there's new studies that are out that show Canada's storage capacity geographically, where it's best to utilize that science geologically to apply the sequestration of CO2. So jobs are incredibly important, and we all know that for every direct job that's lost, there's 3 to 4 indirect jobs. So it's pretty important to take care of our natural resources and these energy industries that helped propel us and put us in a position where we get to enjoy the comfort of heating and electricity and just modern society as we know it today. So it's incredibly important to find that sweet spot, and carbon capture technology certainly brings that with that win-win story of preserving jobs, creating jobs, and cleaning the environment. I hope that helps, and great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it does help. Thank you, Corey. Just to go back to Karen Ogun-Taves, I've got this question. Across the country, we know that Indigenous peoples and communities are some of the most active participants in natural resource development. Earlier, you spoke about the social hardship that poverty causes. Can you tell us a bit more about what the equity participation opportunity means for Indigenous peoples? Karen.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for that question. I think that equity participation means that this would be in the line of the truth and reconciliation, the economic reconciliation that we're moving forward. I think that it's very important because we need to continue with our own source revenue within our communities to really improve the quality of life for our people. We must continue with that whole notion of equity participation. That means that there's more certainty for major projects. It means more certainty that own source revenue coming for First Nations will help the community with our socioeconomic issues that we face on a daily basis. So I think equity participation is the way to go in this day and age so that Indigenous people can increase their livelihood and increase those bringing the quality of life for our First Nations people. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. I think we're getting close to the end of our time now, and I would like to turn back to our moderators. And we do have one last, I'm just getting updated here. One last opportunity for questions before we wrap up here. And I will just give you a little further background on our coming steps with the Task Force for Real Jobs, Real Recovery, while anyone who wants to send me that question to wrap it up does so. We're going to continue into 2021 to bring forward the 19 recommendations that were ultimately in our report that was published. Again, it's at the realrecovery.ca website. We're happy to do interviews. Anyone you've seen here, we have a number of other advisory council members who were quite engaged in this. A lot of hours were spent over the pandemic summer, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to come to a close here. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and also parliamentarians, this is for you. Please be sure to tune in at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time today for a discussion, more from Patricia Moore, who was on this call, and Marc Plamondon of Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association. And we're going to go deeper into some of the issues that they were raising, both Marilena and Patricia. So on that note, thank you all for participating. Thank you, panelists, and I wish you a good day. Thanks.